And we all have rough days sometimes. And I heard this story about this guy who had it was one of those days at work. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And he got home from work, and his wife very kindly greeted him at the door. But he just wanted to be upfront. He told her right away. He's like, hey, I have had the longest, worst day. So if there's, any bad news, anything went wrong today, can you just save it for another time? Just good news. And she's like, okay, good news only. So those 4 kids that we have, 3 of them did not break an arm today. And we laugh because we've been there, right? Bad days are a part of life. And sometimes they don't stop at a day. A bad day turns into a bad week or a bad month or even bad years. Trouble has a way of showing up uninvited. And maybe some of you are experiencing right now. Maybe it's a job loss or a diagnosis or a betrayal or a broken dream. Maybe you're just in the middle of it right now. Jesus didn't sugarcoat that for us. In John 16:33, he told his disciples plainly, in this world you will have trouble. Now, that's a Bible verse that you don't see on coffee mugs very often. But it's a very straightforward promise. Fortunately, he didn't stop there. And he also added, but take heart because I have overcome the world. And that is really the message that we need. Not that trouble is here to stay, but that trouble doesn't get the final word. And that's why I want to spend the next several weeks looking at the life of Joseph. If anyone in the Bible knew what it was like to have a string of bad days, it was him. At just 17 years old, his world began to unravel. He was the favorite son, gifted with dreams, but he was betrayed by and hated by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and forgotten in prison. His life reads like a list of worst-case scenarios. And yet, somehow, he held on. More than that, Joseph saw the big picture. Not right away, not easily, but through every betrayal and hardship, God was at work. And Joseph learned to trust him along the way. The book of Genesis spotlights Joseph's story, not because he was perfect, but because his life shows us how to walk by faith when we can't see what God is doing. Joseph is a reminder that even when life feels out of control, God is still in control. And that matters to us. Because when you can't make sense of what's happening in your life, when you feel burdened or disappointed or confused or in pain, Joseph reminds you that God's story is bigger than your moment. What others meant for evil, God can use for good. The setbacks become set-ups. The pit becomes a pathway to the palace. So let's dive into Joseph's story together. We're going to walk with him through the highs and the lows, and hopefully by the end, we'll not only understand his journey better, but we'll learn to see our own stories in a new light. His bad day begins with a dream. Joseph's story is a story of dreaming. Genesis 37 opens with a short snapshot of a young man full of promise and potential. We read in verse 2 and 3, when Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. At this point in his life, things could not look better for Joseph. He was favored by his father, trusted with responsibilities, and wrapped in a richly ornamented robe that marked him as special, a gift from his dad that set him apart from everybody else in the family. At 17, Joseph had every reason to believe that his future was bright. Like many young people graduating right now, that he probably had dreams of success and purpose and a meaningful life. But in his case, those dreams were more than just youthful ambitions. They were literal dreams, visions given to him by God. And one morning he decided to share one of those dreams with his brothers. He tells them in verse 6, We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. So he has this dream about bundles of grain and his brother's grain bowing before his bundle of grain. It's kind of weird. But then a little later, he shares another one. He has another one of these dreams. And he says that the sun, moon, and 11 stars all bowed before me. And this one caught not only his brother's attention, but even his father questioned him, raising an eyebrow. Do you mean to say that your mother and I and your 11 brothers are all going to bow before you someday? Now, it's important to understand that these weren't just the imaginative musings of a teenager with a superiority complex. These dreams were divinely inspired revelations. God was giving Joseph a prophetic glimpse into his own future, into the role that he would one day play. Joseph didn't know how, and he certainly didn't know when, but God was showing him that he had a plan, a big picture that Joseph was a part of. And isn't that something that we all long for? A sense of purpose, a belief that our lives aren't random or meaningless. Maybe you can remember when your dreams were, or what your dreams were when you were 17. You know, maybe you dreamed of going off to college or starting a career or finding love or doing something that mattered with your life. And I'm sure some of those dreams came true. Others probably didn't. Some changed along the way. But Joseph's story reminds us that even when our dreams fade or shift, God's plan remains. His dreams don't depend on our perfect performance. They depend on His perfect purpose. Joseph believed that God had a future for him, even when he couldn't see the whole picture. And that's what faith does. It trusts God with the pieces of the puzzle, even when we can't make sense of them yet. And it's a lesson that many of us need, because sometimes God's plans include seasons of struggle. You know, sometimes the path to purpose is through pain. You know, what feels like a setback might actually be preparation. What feels like resistance might be building strength. God has not forgotten you. He is forming you. Joseph didn't realize it, but his struggles were about to begin. His dreams weren't a shortcut to glory. They were an invitation to trust God through the hard road ahead. And that's what we see as we continue to follow his journey. So when you face trials that come along with trusting God's plan, when your dreams don't unfold the way that you had hoped, remember Joseph. And remember, God is always working on the big picture. But as Joseph would soon learn, not everyone shared his excitement about these dreams that God had given him. In fact, the very people who should have supported him, his own brothers, became the first major obstacle in his journey, which brings us to the next part of Joseph's story, and that is despising. A story of despising. As you can imagine, being Joseph's favorite, or being Joseph's father's favorite, didn't earn him any points with his siblings. In fact, that lavish colored coat, the amazing Technicolor dream coat that his father gave him, all that did is make his brothers all the more jealous and angry with him and bitter toward him. And so the Bible tells us, this is verses 4 and 8 of chapter 37, but his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him, and they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. And the Hebrew word translated hate here means more than just disliking someone. It implies a deep, burning hostility. They despised Joseph. They loathed him. Their bitterness festered in open hostility, and eventually they entertained thoughts of murder. I mean, can you imagine what it must have been like growing up in that kind of environment? And day after day, they criticized him, they cut him down, they pushed him around, sarcasm, jealousy, bullying. Maybe you don't have to imagine. Maybe you've lived it. Maybe you're living it right now. And yet, in spite of all the hatred hurled at him, Joseph never let it crush his spirit or steal his sense of purpose. One day, while Joseph's brothers were out pasturing their flocks, Jacob sent Joseph to go check on them. Seems like Dad knew that they often were up to no good. And so he sends Joseph to go check on them. And ever obedient, Joseph set out on a journey to go find them. And when his brothers saw him coming in the distance, their hatred boiled over. The Bible says in verse 19 and 20, "Here comes that dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." Reuben, the oldest, intervened with a slightly less sinister plan. He said, "Let's not kill him. Let's just beat him up a little bit and then throw him in the cistern. And then, he'll die of natural. He'll just starve to death or something. Like, why get blood on our hands, right? Let's not be too over dramatic here." And he was planning to come back later and rescue Joseph. But the other brothers didn't know that. And so they all go along with the plan. They steal his coat. They beat him up. They throw him in the cistern. And then they leave him down there. This symbol of favor and identity, that multicolored coat that he wore, was stripped from him. And he was tossed into a deep, dark pit. Can you imagine the terror and confusion that Joseph must have felt in that moment? Betrayed, abandoned, alone. Maybe you can relate. Maybe you found yourself in your own kind of pit. Joseph's pit was literal, a dark, empty cistern, a well in the middle of nowhere. But our pits tend to come in different forms. Maybe yours came in the form of a diagnosis or divorce papers or crushing debt. Maybe it was the death of someone you love. Or maybe your pit was a place of abuse or addiction or abandonment. Whatever your pit looks like, one thing is certain. When you're down there, your only thought is how to get out. Joseph would be the first to tell you that the pit is awful. It stinks. It's scary. It feels like the end. But here's the strange thing. The pit has a purpose. It forces us to look up. Because when you're at the bottom, the only way out is rescue from above. And that's exactly what Joseph needed. God would reach down to deliver Joseph, just not in the way that he expected. And that brings us to the last part of this story, or at least this chapter of his story, deliverance. As his story continues, the brothers, having thrown Joseph into the cistern, sit down to enjoy a meal together as if nothing had happened at all. They're just sitting there eating their lunch. Their consciences are so hardened by hatred that they can eat while their brother is crying out for help from the bottom of the cistern just a few yards away. And then something unexpected happens. This is verses 25 through 28 of chapter 37. Then, just as they were sitting down to eat, they look up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, Joseph's brothers pulled him up out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. To Joseph, being sold into slavery must have felt like a death sentence. Torn from his family, stripped of his freedom, and marched off to a foreign land in chains. This didn't look anything like deliverance. It looked like devastation. But what Joseph couldn't see in that moment was that God was already at work. While Joseph was stuck in the pit, God was orchestrating his rescue. The arrival of that caravan wasn't luck, it was providence. God used his brother Judah's self-interest, his desire to profit. He's like, hey, why kill him when we can make some money instead? God used his greed as a vehicle of grace. He turned human greed into a means of deliverance. Instead of dying in the bottom of the well, Joseph was given a second chance. And though it came in an unlikely form. Sometimes God's deliverance doesn't look like what we expect. It might not come with fireworks and freedom. It might not feel good at first, but it's deliverance just the same. Joseph didn't know it yet, but his unexpected detour was the first step in a much bigger journey from the pit all the way to the palace. And as believers, we need to cling to this truth. Even when life falls apart, even when others betray us or circumstances go horribly wrong, God is still at work. He's not absent in our suffering. He's active in it. Behind the scenes, He is weaving every thread, even the dark and painful ones, into a beautiful tapestry of deliverance and redemption. Joseph's dreams had convinced him that God had a plan for his life. And though those dreams may have seemed shattered when he was sold into slavery, he never let them go. His faith in God's plan sustained him through slavery, false accusations, and even imprisonment. And in time, many, many years later, those dreams would come true. Joseph would rise to power, become second in command in Egypt, and his brothers would indeed bow before him just as he saw in those dreams. But instead of using his position to punish them, Joseph forgave them, saying at the end of Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." That's the God that we serve. A God who can take the worst that this world throws at us and turn it into something beautiful. Now, maybe you're in a season in life where life feels like anything but deliverance. Maybe you're in the pit, or maybe you feel like you're in prison. Don't lose heart. God has not forgotten you. He is working even in the pain to bring us genuine deliverance. Joseph reminds us that sometimes what looks like the end is really just a whole new beginning. Joseph's story teaches us that the path to God's purpose is rarely smooth. He had dreams, God-given visions of a future filled with influence and blessing. But before those dreams could become a reality, he was despised by his brothers, thrown into the pit, and sold as a slave. It would have been easy to give up, to lose hope, or to just assume that his dreams were delusions of grandeur. But through it all, Joseph held on to the belief that God was still in control. And he was. Even in those dark moments, God was orchestrating Joseph's deliverance. Not in an instant, but through a process. Step by step, setback by setback, God was moving Joseph closer to the future that he had promised. And maybe today you feel caught somewhere between the dream and the deliverance. Maybe you're facing rejection or betrayal or uncertainty. Remember Joseph. Remember that the God who gave the dream is the same God who can bring it to pass. And even when others despise you or tear you down, God is still in control. Next week, we'll continue the journey as Joseph arrives in Egypt. It's a place where things go from bad to worse, and yet it's also where Joseph's integrity and faith and God's favor shine the brightest. So don't miss it. For today, in the meantime, maybe you feel like you're in the pit right now, lonely, overwhelmed, unsure of what comes next. Maybe you're waiting, hoping, praying for God to reach out and lift you up. If that's where you are, take heart. God is with you. Just as he was with Joseph, he is with you. And if you've never put your faith in Jesus as your Savior, or if you need to recommit your heart and life to him today, I want to invite you to come. If you're ready to take that next step of faith, whatever that might be, just come forward as we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.